Good afternoon and good evening to our friends in Palestine. I am Katherine Franke, a professor at the law school at Columbia University and one of the faculty associated with the Center for Palestine Studies at Columbia. Welcome to what is a critical conversation that we will have over the next hour or so on conflating human rights advocacy with terrorism. Israel's designation of 6 Palestinian human rights organizations as terrorist organizations. Before we get started, let me also acknowledge that this event is co-sponsored between the Center for Palestine Studies, the Center for Constitutional Rights, and the Institute for Palestine Studies. And we're thrilled to have them as partners in putting on this important conversation. As some of you are aware who are closely affiliated with Columbia, we are in the midst of a labor crisis at the university. The university is in negotiations with our graduate student union, recently recognized graduate student union, and the students are on strike because of the deplorable behavior of the university, negotiating more as a union-busting corporation than as an educational institution committed to treating all members of our community fairly as workers, as students, and as humans. And in conversations with the union about their demands for a living wage, for benefits that are appropriate and humane, and for a range of other reasonable demands that other universities have recognized, we asked them if they would like us to cancel today's event, which many other organizations at Columbia have done in solidarity with the strike, and they said no. Please begin the event by acknowledging the importance of the union negotiations, by acknowledging the deplorable behavior of the university. But we, the union, stand in solidarity with Palestinians, Palestinian activists and human rights actors. We are allies in these struggles together across borders. And many of the issues that are at stake at home are ones that Palestinians feel equally, if not in most cases, much more acutely. So we, with their blessing, we're proceeding with this event, but I just wanted to begin the event with an acknowledgement that we are enduring our own, more privileged in so many respects, but nevertheless important battles on campus as well, and that this event takes place on that landscape of issues at Columbia. Well, with that, I want to pass off the baton to my wonderful colleague, Professor Rashid Khalidi, who is the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University, who will introduce our speakers and move us through the conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Katherine. Thanks to the partner organizations who are helping to sponsor this, the ones that Katherine mentioned, the Institute for Palestine Studies, with which I'm also associated, and the Center for Constitutional Rights, which does such wonderful work. Let me introduce our 3 speakers. The first is Sahar Francis. She is the director of Ramallah-based Addameer Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, which is a Palestinian NGO that provides legal and advocacy support to Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli and Palestinian prisons. An attorney by training, she joined the association in 1998, first as a human rights lawyer, then as head of the legal unit, and she became the director of Addameer in 2006. She has over 16 years of human rights legal experience, including human rights counseling and representation. Ms. Francis was also on the board of Defense for Children International for 4 years. It's another one of the organizations that was sanctioned by the Israeli government. And she was on the board of the Union of Agricultural Work Committees, yet another of the organizations that came under this attack. Khaled Quzmar is the General Director of Defense for Children International, Palestine. He joined DCIP in 1995. He is also a lawyer, and he did so as a lawyer representing Palestinian children in military courts. He may say a little bit about that later. He rose through the ranks of DCIP to become Administrative and Legal Affairs Director. He holds a master's degree in international human rights law and specializes in issues of juvenile justice and grave violations against children during armed conflict. He earned a Master's of Law degree in International Human Rights from the Irish Center for Human Rights at the National University of Ireland in Galway. Maria LaHood, LaHood, as she pronounces it correctly, I gave it its Arabic pronunciation. Maria is the Deputy Legal Director at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where she represents Palestinian rights advocates facing suppression in the United States in cases such as Bronner versus Duggan, defending against a challenge to the American Studies Association resolution endorsing a boycott of Israeli academic institutions, and the Jewish National Fund versus the Campaign for Palestinian Rights, a case challenging human rights advocacy under the Antiterrorism Act. We're going to proceed as follows. I'm going to ask first Sahar and then Khaled to speak for 5 or 10 minutes about the work of their organizations and how they believe that this terrorist designation is meant to affect the work or has already affected the work of their organizations. After that, I'll ask Maria to situate this designation by the Israeli government in the context of American and Israeli, of US anti-terrorism laws. And I will ask each of you to speak for 5 or 10 minutes, Maria, maybe 5 minutes. Then we will pose some questions to our 3 panelists. Katherine and I will pose some questions, and then we'll leave a little time for Q&A. We will be open for questions via the Q&A feature of Zoom, not via the chat function. So, Sahar, can I ask you to please go ahead? The floor is yours.
Yes, good evening, and thanks, Rashid, thanks, Katherine, and the organizers. It's really very important opportunity for us to speak today about this designation, but allow me first to highlight the fact that under the Israeli military orders, lots of unions were declared as illegal entities by the military orders, and unionists were imprisoned, as well students. Student unions in Palestine are illegal, and hundreds of students would be targeted because of their activism in their universities for their rights. So actually the designation against the Addameer and all the other organizations is not a new step. It's a continuity of a long-term campaign, harassment and distributing false information, defamation, and so on against us because of our work, like because of the importance of the work that these organizations are implementing on the ground. And the campaign is not just targeting these 6 organizations. Maybe now we are designated, but we should put it in the context for again, like the attack that was launched against the Palestinian civil society for decades now. More than 50 organizations in East Jerusalem were shut down in the 90s after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, to put a political saying that the Palestinian Authority has no jurisdiction to be present and active in East Jerusalem. So every time they have another political motivation and political reason why they should undermine the work of the civil society organizations. Currently, I think the developments on the international level concerning the work versus the International Criminal Court, the fact that the prosecutor in the ICC declared that they will initiate the investigation in the Palestinian case, the fact that the UN published the blacklist, the success on the PDS movement campaign, all these, and the change on the paradigm of apartheid, like now there's more focus that it's not anymore just a long-term occupation, but it's more a kind of apartheid regime. All these developments caused the Israelis to be more worried because of our work on the international level. And of course, other organizations, not just the Addameer and the DCI and Al-Haq in this case, if we take the example of the health work committees or the agriculture work committees, their work in Area C, in maintaining the farmer in their lands and the constructions in the lands in Area C would be the reason for the attack. So in our case, it's the work for all these 3 decades, more or less, against the military court system in disclosing how unjust is this system, how the occupiers cannot actually prosecute hundreds of Palestinian civilians under this military court system and pretend to be the only democracy in the occupied territories. The fact that we were talking a lot about the torture, the ill treatment, the arbitrary detention, the mass arrest campaigns, and all the other violations that these prisoners face on the daily level, the fact that we are exhausting the UN system very especially in the last couple of years with the complaints that we are submitting, the complaints that we submitted to the ICC, as I said, against the military system. So all this work was, I think, the reason why we were attacked. And the office of Addameer was raided several times, like at least 3 times, where they entered to the office in 2012 and 2019. They ended up stealing more than 11 computers so far that we never got back, and they were investigating the information. They never came and said, this is the results that we reached to in this investigation. I think this is a political manipulation of the Israeli law of anti-terror of 2016, and it should be highlighted that it shouldn't be implemented in the occupied territories. And I think so far they used this law because they are fully aware that would be very effective on our work as organizations offering legal aid for prisoners in their courts, because actually by this they can attack our lawyers, our team that goes to the prison visits, the lawyers who implement the prison visit. And this was the immediate impact on our work, that our lawyers were terrified, they were resigning, they were trying to start to work as individual lawyers, as private lawyers, and not to be associated, because they could be easily arrested and criminalized in the Israeli courts as aiding and supporting illegal and terrorist entity. So far, our offices were not raided, our bank accounts were not freezed, and no one so far was imprisoned. But this can be easily implemented, especially after they also used the military order by designating us according to the military order as illegal entities. The impact of the orders on the civil society, on the group that we service, of course, it will affect families of prisoners and prisoners under interrogation and in the military court and in the detention facilities. So this is why we are trying to find alternative with the support of other Palestinian NGOs that offer and work in the same sector of prisoners.
Thank you very much, Sahar. Khaled, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Rashid, and thanks to all the colleagues for organizing this important event. If I understand well the question, because there was cut in the internet with me, but if I understand well, the effects of the designation and the military order, I don't want to repeat what Sahar mentioned, but it's applied also for what our organization and even the others. But just I stress on the point that what happened with the 2 decisions, the Israeli Defense Minister decision label the organization as a terrorist organizations, and later on the Israeli military commander military order to designate the organization as illegal organizations. So why two decisions in the same time within 2 weeks? I don't know. It's something strange, and we read it as, I consider it as part of the attacks against the civil society organizations against us, which these attacks started maybe years ago, 10 years ago, through Israeli right-wing groups like NGO Monitor, Human Rights, UK Lawyers for Israel, and other organizations, and also from the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs and Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So the escalation happened, at least to talk about DCI, in July 2021, after they failed all the attacks during the years to silence DCI. So they raided the office in 29 of July 2021. Direct after a few hours of that, raided the office and confiscating the computers. We complained to the Israeli military court, and the Israeli military court did, I think, more than 5 hearing court without any development in the court, just postponing the case until the designation of the organization as a terrorist organization. Then they decided to reject our complaint because basically our organization is considered as illegal organization. So why illegal in the Israeli military system, and why terrorist in the anti-terror law? Something is not clear until now. So the effects is really, we are in a very critical time. Our work is in both sides, under the Israeli military jurisdiction and under the Palestinian jurisdiction. The designation is against the organization at all the work, all the stuff. So until now we are working. Nothing happened until now, but we don't know what will happen. But if they started to implement these laws, the military order and the law, that will affect, of course, our work. First of all, in our work in the Israeli military court, because of course we are working there in between their hands. They can stop, they can arrest the lawyers who are representing the organizations they are representing the prisoners, and also our field workers who are documenting the violation in children by the Israeli soldiers or settlers. Of course, they will be subject to arrest. The same work that we are doing, we are more than 70% of our work is also under the Palestinian Authority. We are working to build a Palestinian juvenile justice system. We're working with lawyers, with the juvenile prosecutors, juvenile police. So this work will be also forbidden, will be even criminalized. Not only our staff is criminalized, also those who are working with us, they will be criminalized. The children, we are working with hundreds of children and to raise their awareness, build their capacity on their rights and how to document the violation against their rights and how to become human rights defenders. Those who are we are working with them to keep the hope with them, because all the time they are under stress. We are targeting children in a certain area which is subject to attacks from the settlers, from the Israeli soldiers every time. So now we are working with, since years, we are working with new generation of the children in order to keep the hope, to help them to become to build their capacity to become human rights defenders. Those also, they will be criminalized and they will be subject to arrest from the Israeli. So I can say in general, or our staff, or our partners, or our beneficiaries, they will be now are living under threat, and they will be subject to arrest. And of course, starting from us as administration of the organization, and also our structure like the General Assembly and the board of directors. So all of us, we decided to continue regardless the decision, regardless the designation. We will continue our work. We are committed to our mission, are committed to our beneficiaries to continue work with them until something happened.
Thank you very much, Khaled. Let me now turn to the American scene, or we will now turn to the American scene with some observations by Maria Dahut. I myself am of the opinion that, like every element of the struggle over Palestine, this has two arenas. It has the arena on the ground, which Khaled and Sahar have just filled us in on, and it has the arena of the United States and Europe. And I honestly think that much of what is intended by this designation has to do with this arena, the United States. So let's hear from Maria, please, about how you think this fits into the context of American anti-terrorist laws. Maria, please.
Thanks so much, Rashid. It's an honor to be here, part of this panel, especially with Sahar and Khaled. CCR is proud to have worked alongside Addameer and DCIP, as well as with Al-Haq, groups that have been advancing human rights for decades under severe repression, which, as Sahar said, is exactly why they're continuing to escalate their ever more desperate attempts to crush the growing movement. And we've seen this here in the US too. Israel's apologists have been increasingly alleging false ties to terrorism to intimidate and silence critics, alongside their claims that BDS and criticism of Israel in general are anti-Semitic. Groups have pressured financial services like PayPal and web hosting platforms like Zoom to suspend services with false allegations. They've brought meritless lawsuits or urged the Department of Justice to investigate meritless claims. Just following the designations last week, a group called Shrat-Hadin threatened to sue a US foundation for aiding and abetting terrorism for funding some of these newly designated organizations. Shrat-Hadin is the Israeli Law Center. It's a nonprofit that's worked with Mossad and the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, and has been trying to link Palestinian rights advocacy with terrorism for years. And they've also long threatened lawsuits against organizations supporting BDS, or even considering it, or even withdrawing from settlements. You know, even though these lawsuits are meritless and absurd, the point is to stop support for Palestinians, and the prospect of litigation itself or of false smears is intimidating and chilling for people. CCR is currently representing the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, one of the oldest Palestine solidarity organizations in the US, in a civil case under the Antiterrorism Act brought by the Jewish National Fund and some US nationals living in Israel, who sued them. And if folks aren't familiar with the Jewish National Fund, it basically predates Israel in taking Palestinian land to be used solely for the benefit of Jewish people. And the JNF is arguing that the US campaign should be liable for damages to land caused by incendiary kites and balloons launched from Gaza during the Great Return March, based on allegations that the US campaign expressed support on social media for Palestinians' right to protest and demand their right to return, because it participated in a campaign to stop the JNF from dispossessing Palestinians of their land, and because it served as a time for fiscal sponsor in the US for the Boycott National Committee, which is a coalition of Palestinian civil society that supports global BDS campaigns. And because one of the BNC members is another coalition made up of many Palestinian parties, one of which is Hamas. So, you know, they launch a press release stating that the US campaign is funneling donations to Hamas. It's all these false allegations. Again, this case was dismissed by the court as meritless. The court found the allegations were, quote, to say the least, not persuasive, unquote. But the JNF has asked the court to reconsider. It's lost. It's now appealing to the DC Circuit. So, you know, it's, even though it's meritless, again, it's a distraction and a nuisance and can be chilling, and that's its intent. So I think, you know, we really need to be, not to be chilled by these designations, by these campaigns to isolate Palestinians and to chill our speech. We really have to increase our support for the organizations, and we need to turn what's otherwise a distraction from the human rights work and Israel's repression into an opportunity to put a spotlight on that repression and really demand action from the US government to pressure Israel. One last quick point, Sahar mentioned the ICC. You know, last June, Trump had issued an executive order declaring a national emergency and authorizing asset freezes and family entry bans against the ICC officials, explicitly because the ICC asserted jurisdiction over US personnel and certain of its allies because of the ICC case and investigation into Palestine. So, you know, then the US imposed sanctions on the ICC prosecutor and another ICC official, basically putting them on a list and saying any person making a contribution, even of services, to designated people could be subject to civil and criminal penalties. So, I mean, that, you know, has been rescinded by Biden, but now we have Israel, you know, sort of eliminating the intermediary and just designating organizations engaged with the ICC.
Great, thank you so much, Maria. I think that maybe now what we're going to do is that Katherine and I will maybe direct a couple of questions to the panelists, which will then be followed by a chance for all of you who are attending either on Facebook or via Zoom to ask questions. I already see that there are a couple of questions in the Q&A function, which is where you should direct your questions. Katherine, do you want to follow up with a question to any one of our panelists, or should I?
Yes, I have so many that I'm going to have to ration myself here.
Go for it.
So for Sahar and Khaled, the designation of being a terrorist organization by the Israelis is best challenged legally and or politically. What is the strategy domestically for your organizations to challenge that designation? I'm familiar with the way that the terrorism laws or the material support laws work in the US, but not under Israeli law. And I'm wondering what you're thinking, without divulging too much of your strategy in ways that you might not want to. But is there a combined political and legal strategy, and what might that look like? And then for Maria, I personally and many other people I know have been donors to these organizations that have now been labeled as terrorists by the Israelis. To what extent does the Israeli designation of them with this particular moniker affect the enforcement or the interpretation of US law in terms of punishing material support for terrorist organizations domestically?
Shall we go in the same order? Yeah. So before answering you, Katherine, I think thanks, Maria, for your intervention. It's really the aim to terrify the donors, especially in the international level, and the banks. The whole issue was in order to affect our financial resources. And we expect that much of lawsuits would come against banks, against every international organization that tries to keep the support for us. On the level of the legal strategy internally, as I said before, all these decades we were working in front of the Israeli system, the military court system, and the Israeli civil system, mainly the Israeli High Court. And we know exactly that there's no guarantee for a fair trial procedure, no guarantee for due process when you talk about a system that relies on secret information. And in both designations, according to the Israeli anti-terror law and the military orders, they will use a secret file against us beside the evidences that they can disclose that we claim it's not enough. And this is actually was the dossier that was presented to the Europeans in May 2021, and they rejected it, and they said it's not sufficient evidence for these allegations, and they didn't took it seriously. So this is why most probably we wouldn't be involved in any legal actions on the level of the law itself, the 2016, which means we will not appeal for the special committee, we will not petition the Israeli High Court. And I think the same strategy would apply with the military procedures, though we are still not there yet. We don't have a final decision on this. And this is why we are pushing on the political level. And this is the most important work now, that we should push states, especially the United States and the European countries, to take action and to take a position, very clear position, that they are not taking the Israeli decision and implementing it locally.
Thank you. I mean, I should first explain, you know, federal criminal law is enforced by the Department of Justice and prohibits knowingly providing material support to any group or individual designated by the US government as a terrorist, or arguably their agents. And the US government has a master list of designated organizations, which none of these groups are on, but the PFLP is. Then there are civil laws, like I mentioned, which any individual or group can bring a suit themselves if they're representing a US national who's been injured by an international act of terrorism. So, I mean, first of all, we should, you know, we have to question the entire terrorism framework, which is inherently political. The state gets to determine who's a terrorist. The definition of terrorism itself is skewed. It's a, you know, dangerous or violent criminal act to influence government policy by intimidation or coercion, or to intimidate, of course, the civilian population. But I think the important thing here is really that we are, first of all, obviously, there's no evidence has been said to support these designations, but also it's important, it makes the support for these groups important. We have to, you know, there have been hundreds of human rights groups that have come out to support them. There was just recently over 100 celebrities. There have been, you know, 17 special rapporteurs. There has been an outpouring of support and condemnation of these designations. And we need to call, more importantly, on the US to basically condemn Israel, to stand by these organizations, to rebuke the designation and make that public, so that people know what the US government's position is. And, you know, there are obviously other things that members of Congress can do and others, but I think the most important thing is that we're not chilled and that we are, you know, collectively continue to support the organizations.
I would just add that I think it's interesting that a number of European governments to which the Israeli government submitted its so-called evidence for these terrorist designations have replied explicitly saying, there's absolutely no evidence here. You've given us no proof. This is shoddy and flimsy, and there's nothing here. These include governments that are normally very supportive of even the most outrageous Israeli claims. So far, that together with the things that Maria had said has been the response. Katherine, do you want to pose another question? You said you had a couple, or should I go ahead?
Maybe
Khaled, do you want to say something? Please go ahead.
Words about the. So, since we are aware about the reasons behind the designation, which is our work in the ICC, in the companies list, the UN companies list, blacklist, and also the work with the Congress and everywhere exposing the Israeli policies. this is, I think this is the reason behind the two decisions, but why two decisions still is not clear. And as a human rights organization working in the Israeli military system and even with the Israeli High Court, our experience there is we examined these legal framework hundreds of times, years, and of course there is no justice for the Palestinian, even with the normal cases. What about cases with legal secret files? So in the secret file they can claim everything, but how we can defend ourselves in front of such. So for that we decided to keep the discussion about this path and to focus more and more in our advocacy, because already we are working advocacy and now they give us more platforms, more networks to work with, to expose the Israeli, not only the Israeli crimes against the Palestinian, but also about our case, about the designation. And we receive different solidarity and support from different levels of the international community. And we are happy about where we are now, and we will continue in this path.
Thank you, Khaled. So Katherine, you mentioned that you had more questions. Do you want to pose one, or should we go to the questions in Q&A? We have a couple of questions.
Yeah, Rashid, I know you have questions, so if you want to maybe pose one, and then we can go to the questions online.
Okay. I have a question actually for the three of you, and it's linked to something that Katherine asked about. All of you have talked about how you plan or how you understand these attacks to be directed. All of you have talked about the two of you, Sahar and Khaled, have talked about how they've impacted your organizations and what they're meant to do, these designations. I want to ask about basically taking Katherine's question further. Assuming, as I do, that the Israeli occupation authorities can do pretty much anything they want to anybody under their control, including your organizations, including you as individuals, including the people who work in your organizations. And as Sahar herself said, this is intended to cut off funding, which means it's intended, among other things, to affect groups like the foundation that Maria mentioned has already been threatened with a suit for its support of some of your organizations. How do each of you think this specific drive here in the United States, and I assume similar drives are taking place in Europe because many of the funding organizations are also European, how do we counter this? What is the best way? Solidarity is fine, but there is a well-funded, well-oiled, heavily lawyered campaign launched by multiple groups in the United States, supported by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, by the thing that used to be called the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which has now been folded into the Israeli Foreign Ministry, which coordinates the activities of organizations across Europe and multiple organizations in the United States, and which simply repeat Israeli talking points and then turn them into what they call lawfare, legal warfare against advocates of Palestinian rights. You have been experiencing in Palestine for decades. And we are now have been experiencing it here for many, many years. How do we counter this lawfare? First, Sahar and Khaled, and then I throw it over to Maria. Sahar?
I think it should be done more or less in the same way. Whenever we find a chance to go against them legally and to sue them, we should use it. But also it's very important to disclose as much as we can information, facts from the ground that clearly shows the lying and the manipulation and the misuse of the information coming from the Israeli military prosecution files presented in the military courts in these cases and in other cases. And I think what we should pressure for now on the level of the State Department is not to take any decision on the American side, like not to list any of these organizations based on this Israeli information, because this would be the end. Actually, Israel pointed to the, like they use this decision in order to affect mostly the banks. We know that all the banking system is controlled by the United States. And if the United States take any action, that's the end. No one can anymore channel anything to these organizations, and not just to these organizations. I mean, it's very serious the way how they are using these tools against civil society, and not just in Palestine. You mentioned as in the United States, in other places, and this is why it's very important now on the international level, the issue of the protection and defense for the human rights community. If it's very easy to classify human rights organizations as anti-terror organizations, I think this will undermine the whole system of human rights. And this is, as the Human Rights Commissioner said herself, this is really manipulation of the laws of the anti-terror that were developed after September 11th. We should stop this.
Thank you. Khaled, do you want to say anything? Please. Tafadhal.
Yeah, I'd like to say a few words, like even through during the 2019, 19, 20, we were subject to different attacks from the Israeli UK Lawyers for Israel, Israeli organization in UK. So we, after different attacks, we decided to prosecute them in the British legal system. But unfortunately, after a few months, we discovered that we have no enough financial capacity to continue the case, because we have to pay to put as a guarantee amount of £500,000 in the court account as a guarantee if we lose the case. So as an organization, we have no such amount to continue the prosecution, and then we stopped. We reached a settlement, at least to silence them. And we, of course, we silent UK Lawyers for Israel since that time until now. But of course, the others are continue the work of UK lawyers like NGO Monitor and others. So I think as a Palestinian human rights organizations and even international organizations, still we are like in a defensive way, just receive attacks and respond to the attacks. But we have, I think, this is the time to develop our strategy to start attack them. Yesterday, we met with the diplomatic missions in Palestine, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs were also attended the Palestinian Ministry, and we agreed in some points to start to designate even Israeli right-wing group to label them as a terrorist groups, like those youth of mountains and others who attack the Palestinian, the settlers, and of course the Israeli army. We failed to use the international mechanism, like to list Israel in the shame list, the Israeli army in the shame list, but we'll start to work with human rights organization, with our supporters around the world to try to find such a way to designate and to attack and to prosecute such groups. And I think this is the time to start such a process.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Want to add
agree.
anything?
I agree. I mean, we have to obviously defend accusations and defend people, and that's something people should, if people need defense, they should call CCR or Palestine Legal. But we also have to go on the offense. We have to use it as an opportunity to educate people about Israel and what an authoritarian and repressive regime it is, and demand that Israel stop displacing, detaining, killing, repressing Palestinians, stop constructing new Jewish-only settlements. And we have to put pressure on the US and unconditional aid and support to Israel. I mean, I think about the BDS, issues, and, Ben and Jerry's recently decided to not, to stop selling ice cream in the settlements. And, the Israeli president called it a new kind of terrorism. In the US, more than half of the states have passed anti-BDS laws about Israel. And then Israel sent them letters saying, you need to go after Ben and Jerry's because of this. And New York State recently pulled out, $100 million in its pension funds out of Unilever because of its subsidiary, Ben and Jerry's. So but those are, each of these states, it's an opportunity for people to talk to legislators about, not only about BDS, but about Israel's repression. And this is, again, the more and more extreme measures taken by Israel and its apologists are because of the growing movement for Palestinian liberation, because it's working. So it is a threat, and I think we just need to continue doing what we're doing.
Well, one of the things that's very clear is that this is intended to have these actions by the Israeli government are intended to have a chilling effect. They're intended to distract and divert Palestinian organizations, both in Palestine and those that support Palestinian rights outside, from their efforts. And they're meant to be very costly. As Khaled said, £500,000 were required to put forward a suit in the United Kingdom. There are many things one could think of. Khaled mentioned treating Israeli organizations as terrorist organizations. Obviously, for that to happen in the United States, we would have to show that a terrorist act under US law affected a US citizen. There are many Palestinian Americans who maybe have been affected by settler attacks. Those could be the basis for legal action against American organizations which openly fund the most aggressive settlements from which these terrorist attacks proceed. It would be costly. It would be a diversion from our efforts, but if it were part of a campaign, which to do what Maria is saying, which is to use this law to highlight abuse, which is, what the late Michael Ratner, one of the founders of the Center for Constitutional Rights, always understood, that law in and of itself can be used for all kinds of purposes. But one of the most important purposes it can be used for is to illuminate issues around rights, to illuminate issues around justice. And I think that there are many, I'm not a lawyer, obviously, 3 or 4 of you are, all of you in fact are. So I'm the least qualified to talk about this. Should we now go to the questions? We have another 25 minutes or so. Why don't we go to the questions? I have a question from Walid Khalaf, who asks, what is the Palestinian Authority's action against these allegations on the ground? And I know that Khaled sort of partially answered that by saying that the Foreign Ministry was at this meeting. But would either of you, Sahar or Khaled, care to respond to this question?
Actually, the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian Authority position was very clear from day one. The Prime Minister issued a statement saying that they reject, and the Ministry of Interior as well, that we are registered under. They issued a statement clearly that we are legal organizations according to the Palestinian Authority. The president himself requested to meet us, and he was saying clearly. And I think in the last 2 days, this issue was raised even in the conference that was for the country donating for the PA, that the position that they reject this decision. But because I think it also put the PA under a huge responsibility while we are talking about anti-terror laws in the areas under the jurisdiction of the PA. At the first hand, it should be under the responsibility of the PA. So Israel, by designating us, they didn't took in consideration at all the existence of the PA and the security of the PA at all. And this is why I believe as well, it's the interest of the Palestinian Authority to defend us and to back us and to refuse this Israeli designation.
Khaled, you have any response?
Sahar said that the president raised the issue, and even the president raised the issue yesterday with the U.S. ambassador in the UN. about the designation of the six organization. But also the Prime Minister, even yesterday we met 8 ministers. They came to Al-Haq and we met them there. All of them, they showed their solidarity. They opened
Eight
their
ambassadors.
offices to us.
Eight
But
ambassadors?
in fact, no,
Ministers.
the ministers.
Of the Palestinian
The
Authority.
ministers yesterday, we met 8 Palestinian ministers, and they promised to give us their offices and all the resources to continue the work. But at the end, as we know, that until now, all the Palestinian, the PLO groups or parties are considered, according to the Israeli military orders, as a terrorist organizations. So at the conclusion, they are going to say to us that we'll come in our club. We become like them, designated as a terrorist. But they have no power. Yeah, they have no power to put pressure on Israel. Just they're receiving attacks, and keeping. So yeah, they have good position in politics, but in fact, nothing for us. The effects.
One more question for both of you from another questioner. Given the publicity, the negative publicity that this Israeli designation has generated, and the absence of any support from even European countries normally friendly to Israel, do either of you think there's any chance that this designation may be retracted by Israel? You can give a yes or no answer to that if you wish. Sahar, Fadali, please go ahead.
I don't think they would cancel this decision, but this is why the political pressure is very important, and the political saying in deciding to continue the support and not to take these allegations into any local actions from states or the European Union as such. This would be a very clear message to the Israelis. Even you keep the designation, you will not be able to implement it. We will continue to support. And this is why it's very important for us, all this campaign, to continue and to maintain the pressure till we reach this point where all the states declare clearly their position.
Go ahead, Khaled, please.
Yes, our demand yesterday, we met with PLO, we met about 30 diplomatic mission in Palestine. And our main demand from them was to show their not only solidarity, their position that they are against the designation, and to show that they are going to support, to continue the cooperation and support. In this case, I believe that will put Israel in a position, maybe because it is a political and security decision, which is not easy to reverse from, but our demand is to reverse. But even that, if they feel that they are rejected, that their argument rejected from all the states, they will keep it, like to freeze it and not to implement it. If they are going to implement it, then they will be in a conflict with all the states, those who are supporting, because the money comes from them, they confiscate the money, then they will create a new conflict with them. So I hope that they will keep in their position, behind their position, to reject this decision and to continue the support and cooperation with us.
There's another question. Again, all of these seem to be directed to you two. I have one for you, Maria, just a minute. And this is a question, will any of your 6 organizations appeal this designation? I think one of you has mentioned, has spoken to this, and I'm not sure if a designation by the Israeli occupation authorities can be appealed. Would either of you care to speak to this, Khaled or Sahar?
As we agreed, and they said only we ask for an extension, because extension to appeal, but it does not mean that we are going to appeal. Until now, this decision is under discussion, and if they will, mostly we are not going to appeal, because they build all the argument according to secret information. So secret information, how to protect, how to defend, we talked about it. So it's useless.
Sahar.
I would just add that there's more than 400 Palestinian different organizations, group are designated. No one single case when the case in front of the military system or the Israeli High Court. And since the founding of this anti-terror law of 2016, also inside Israel, there's no one single case that succeeded in such legal procedures. And this is why most probably there's no point to try and put efforts in these appeals or petitions.
Thank you, both of you.
Rashid,
yes, Catherine, go ahead, please.
Just for a second, I think this idea of as a form of political resistance, trading in the concept of who is a terrorist and throwing it back at the Israeli government or various of its subdivisions is an appealing tactic. And I just wanted to invite Maria to talk a little bit. She began her remarks with, we got to get out of this terrorism frame. We have to stop using that frame. And I know a lot of the domestic work that we do, I used to be on the board of the Center for Constitutional Rights and was very familiar that there was an ethos of trying to find alternative framings than turning always to terrorism as a way to describe collective violence directed at communities that we cared about or were in alliance with. So you think about police violence, there are many who would want to say it was a form of domestic terrorism. And I know CCR has resisted that frame for principled reasons. I also want to acknowledge that in Palestine, there's a lot less room to be pure and to take tactics, to pursue tactics that are that don't have complexity, because everything has complexity for Palestinian lawyers and activists. So I don't want to imply that that we should hold our politics up to some impossible standard. But I guess I wanted to invite some reflections on what it is for us to deploy the terrorism frame against a much more powerful entity like the Israeli government, rather than perhaps, or maybe at the same time, pursuing alternative frames that may, in the longer run, be more productive. For any of you, Maria, specifically in the US context, but
Maria first, perhaps.
Well, I mean, I would love to hear about others' thoughts, but you know, we have frames. We have international humanitarian law, we have international human rights law, we have criminal law, we have, and again, their laws aren't perfect. There's, you know, they were also made by the powerful, but it's clear that anti-terrorism laws are, you know, the state determining who can't do what, and it doesn't apply equally to all. So I think we have what we need, and I don't know that it's helpful. It is maybe helpful conceptually to talk about, you know, Israel's reign of terror and targeting of civilians, but I don't know that actually applying the law, like you said, Catherine, to others as well is any more helpful, because it's going to be used always against the less powerful. It's always going to be used against the communities who are being oppressed, because that's its nature.
I actually have a number of other questions, which, unless Khaled and Sahar want to speak to Catherine's question. No, Khaled, would you like to say anything? No? Okay. I'm not hearing you. Sorry, your sound is off.
Yes, there was cut in the internet. I missed the question.
No, I just asked if you had any response to Catherine's question, or should I go on to another question?
I have nothing.
Why don't you pick up another question, Rashid?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple, and they're directed mainly. I think several of these are directed to Maria. You can maybe see them in the chat, in the Q&A. Ella asks, how likely is it that the US will add any of the organizations to their list? Samia asks, has there been any reaction from China or Russia? So those are two questions. Maybe Maria first, and then Khaled and Sahar. How likely do you think it is that the United States is going to add these organizations?
I don't think it's likely at all. I mean, you know, the State Department spokesperson came out and said we believe respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, and a strong civil society are critically important for responsible and responsive governance. But I don't think it's enough. And you know, members of Congress have called on the executive to come out strong. I mean, you know, members of government have met with these groups. You know, it doesn't benefit them either. But again, I don't think it's enough for them to just not designate them. I think they need to come out and say, these, you know, we support these organizations. The accusations are false, and they are not considered terrorists in our book. And again, pressure Israel to do the same.
Sahar, do you want to say anything? Please.
I'm not aware if Russia or China dealt or made any statement on this case, but I, like, beside what Maria was saying about the framework, I think it's very important to highlight that the difference in our context, that we are still under occupation and the Palestinian Authority is not an independent state yet, but it was recognized under the UN system as a state that is able to sign international agreements, international treaties. And this is why I highlighted that on the anti-terror regulations and the fight against terror, it should be the responsibility of the Palestinian Authority, not the Israeli occupation. And this is very important because here, in this case, I don't think Israel is really have anything related to their security. If we are really causing a very direct, immediate threat to the security of the state of Israel, why we are still free, me and Khaled? And I'm touring now around the world for this cause. It's ridiculous. It's not related to security. It's total manipulation for the rules, the laws, and the international law on this case.
Khaled, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, but back to the US, I think if as the Biden administration promised to change, I think this is the time to change the behaviors and the policy that Trump used to behave in the Palestine case. So this is the case, the human rights case, the international law case. I think they have to behave in a different way. Until now, what they did is, I can consider it not green light to continue for the Israeli. It's a partnership in the crime. They have to change to stand behind the international law. And as organizations, we are ready to be prosecuted in any fair trial court around the world, but not in the Israeli legal system or the military system, because both of them experienced for tens of years with no justice for the Palestinian.
There's a question here, which isn't really a question. I'm going to say something about it. And then I hope the three of you can say something, maybe Maria first, and then Sahar or Khaled. And the question is, wouldn't applying the terrorist designation to non-government groups in the occupied territories help to raise awareness of the issue in the United States? Is the issue that advocates want to focus all efforts on the Israeli government, and that identifying private parties who facilitate attacks would somehow dilute their efforts? My initial reaction when the Israeli government came out with this designation is that they had overstepped even their outrageous previous limits on what the Israeli government would do. These are highly respected organizations, all six of them. They have absolutely nothing. There's absolutely no way that they can in any way be accused of having anything to do with terrorism. And the flimsy evidence has now been blown apart by every party to whom the Israelis have so far shown that evidence. I actually think that this is an opportunity. I think all of your organizations, I think, are using it. Sahar mentioned that she's going around speaking. We are having this panel. I've seen two other panels on this topic. I think that this is an incredibly important educational opportunity. And two questions, and I'll throw it out to the three of you, maybe first to Maria, that are related to this. Say, maybe is this maybe the time to try and challenge the US terrorist designations of some Palestinian organizations, specifically the PFLP or others. The American terrorist list is long, and I don't know what the process is for challenging it. I don't know if either Maria or Katherine or either of the two of you, Sahar and Khaled, have anything that you can say about this. Maria?
I think it very well could be. I mean, that's another way to go on the offense, challenge the whole framework, challenge the fact that there are, many Palestinian organizations on there, like the PFLP. And there is, there was another question about other human rights organizations. As I mentioned, more than 300 human rights groups signed on in support of these organizations and against the designations. And we are continuing to talk about ways that we can challenge this, how we can go further. So yeah, we appreciate any and all ideas.
I think
Katherine, do you want to say anything about this?
I do, but I'll defer to Sahar first.
So Khaled, Sahar, either of you, please.
I think the same point was raised lately in the last week by European civil society organizations, because it's also the European list that have 7 Palestinian political parties listed, and it caused so many different implications. But I would prefer to highlight, as I said before, in the international level, there is a serious problem with these anti-terror laws in most of the countries that they initiated such laws and started to implement them. A couple of weeks ago, an amnesty office was shut down in Taiwan, if I'm not mistaken, and based on the same allegations as a terrorism involvement. This is ridiculous that states are using, democratic and undemocratic states are using the anti-terror laws in a very bad way against criticism and other human rights demands. So I think this should be an initiative on the global level, in the UN level, to really put more restrictions and conditions in implementing these laws in respect of human rights and international treaties to protect human rights.
Yes, a few words, yeah. The designation of not the designation, the list, the EU list, and even the US list, the terrorist list. This was under discussion with the Palestinian PLO a few days ago, and we argued them to appeal and to follow the case in Europe and in the US. They promised to study it because, as I mentioned before, most of the Palestinian functions or parties are still recognized as a terrorist in Israeli system, but in Europe and in the US, at least 5 or 6 Palestinian organizations or parties are listed without any fair trial court, just they listed according to Israeli information or security information from the Israeli side. So I believe that they have the right to be to appeal or to follow this case. For the effects of the campaigns that now we are running around the world, we used before to expose the Israeli policies according to our capacity with our networks and focusing on the work that we are doing. But now they gave us more networks, more like what you mentioned a few minutes ago, this meeting and other meetings. They gave us more and more space to attack and even to expose the Israeli policies. And we are, in this case, by designating such an effective organization, human rights organization, a well-known organization, and most of our organizations are affiliated to international human rights organization around the world, I think it is it's back negative impact for the Israeli decision around the world now.
Thank you. Maybe I'll leave the last word to you, Katherine.
It's true. We are close to the end of our time.
We are very
also
close. Yeah.
And it's late in Palestine, and I want to thank our guests for joining us so late in the evening. But in terms of one of the ways that I think we could subvert, excuse me, the strategy is for each of us to, make a contribution to all 6 of these organizations and see the terrorism designation as a kind of seal of approval for those of us globally. My apologies for losing my voice all of a sudden. So I'm going to send $10 to each of these organizations. You should too. We have over 100 people on this call. And that will undermine what they're doing, I think, in really significant ways.
There are 100 people still on the call. There were over 120 at the height. Right. And that is an idea. One of the things that this is intended to do is to cut off funding to these organizations and to intimidate people and to chill speech. So anything anybody can do to challenge this on a personal level or on a collective level, I'm sure will be welcome. This is a bridge too far. They've overreached. And the fact that the reaction so far has been quite negative in Europe and in the United States is, I think, evidence of that. And I think that the pendulum is in some ways beginning to swing back. It's very hard to see maybe from Palestine, but as someone who has watched events in the United States for many, many decades and has lived in the United States more than half of my life, we are in a new moment in the United States as far as openness to the issue of Palestine and openness to support for Palestinian rights and questioning of Israel's policies and actions. And I think this is a terrible challenge, obviously, but it's also an enormous opportunity. I want to thank Sahar and Khaled, who stayed up until 9:15 Palestine time to be with our audience. I want to thank Maria, who's here in New York with me, for participating. I want to thank CCR for all of their enormous efforts. I should say on behalf of the Center for Palestine Studies, which Katherine and I are both involved with, and on behalf of the Institute for Palestine Studies in Washington, D.C., and with offices in Beirut and Ramallah, we're honored to be able to feature voices like Sahar's, voices like Khaled's, voices like Maria's, for all of our organizations, which are dedicated to informing people about issues having to do with rights. And in the case of Institute for Palestine Studies and the Center at Columbia for Palestinian rights, for Palestine Studies, dedicated to focusing on Palestine. For us, this has been a very, I hope everybody's enjoyed it and benefited from it as much as I have. Thank you very much, everybody. And good evening and good afternoon.
Thank you.